begin.
Yeah. So we're live here on Facebook, and I'm just going to go live on LinkedIn. Yep. I think we're there. So, welcome, Dr. Robert, for our little short conversation about the huge topic that we have today about how can families heal through trauma. Before we start, I've prepared a little introduction about Dr. Robert for anyone who's new and would like to get to know you. So this is a very short introduction for Dr. Robert. So it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Robert, who's the CEO of Arizona Trauma Institute and the president of Trauma Institute International. Dr. Robert has dedicated his career to improving mental health care, supervising, mentoring numerous clients and programs with unparalleled expertise and compassion. Over the past 3 years, Dr. Robert has been a guiding light to our organization also, helping us become more truly trauma-informed. He's been a mentor and invaluable guide to the approach that we're taking here at Trauma Release and Wellness Center. So please, I'm going to invite everyone to kind of, who's watching, to really kind of welcome Dr. Robert here today.
Thank you. I really appreciate it. I enjoy the work that we do and the work your center does there in Karachi.
So I want to start off by this big question about, that when we have a lot of families that come in, or when we have a lot of people that come in who've gone through trauma, I think it'll be good to just kind of get a little bit of a basic definitions kind of down here, in terms of what trauma kind of really means in terms of the family context. A lot of people might be well aware of an individual going through something. They might even be well aware of the definition of the body in terms of how it's impacted by trauma. But how does the trauma kind of get defined in the family context here?
Well, when you're looking at trauma in a family context, you are almost always looking at environmental factors that create toxic stress in the environment, or where there is kind of repeated adversity, and without an adequate network of nurturing support. And so, a lot of times people think, well, it's only a trauma generating family if there's physical or sexual abuse, if there's physical and emotional neglect, then of course there's trauma. But what people fail to understand is you don't need any of those to generate symptoms. If you have a very punitive environment, if you're very aggressive, if the adults in the environment are chaotic, they're creating an environment. And children react to what they experience in their body. It's not logical, it's not reasonable, it doesn't have it's not thought through. It is their body is having these overwhelming physical experiences, and they don't have a language for it, so it gets acted out in behavior. But almost always, the level of disturbance we see in the child reflects the disturbance in the leadership of the family. And that's not very comfortable. People would really like to believe that the child is the problem. And as long as we believe that, we don't have to change the environment. But you often have well-meaning parents, but they're not regulated themselves well enough, or they haven't resolved their own trauma history well enough to really be able to adequately nurture a child or support a child. And it doesn't mean they're bad parents. They may not know how to attach in a reasonable way, or they manage their family through pretty strict dictatorial, you'll do it my way kind of mentality, which just adds layers and layers of stress in the family environment. So most of the time, what our experience has been over 40 years of doing this stuff is that if I have a referral for a child, I'm glad to meet with that child. But almost always the initial change has to be in the ability of the parents to manage themselves. And then the next piece is for those parents that are managing themselves well, is to actively, with intention, create a nurturing environment. And a lot of people did not grow up exposed to that. And so they don't really know how to do it naturally. And so it does require effort, and it requires intentionality. It requires well-regulated adults. It's so much easier to kind of make the child the scapegoat for the parental failure.
Absolutely.
I'm not judging parents. I'm just saying, you know, I can tell you from my own experience, I grew up in a family where the parents did not know how to nurture. They did not know how to really love children or support them. I had to learn that as an adult raising my own children. So I made a lot of mistakes I really didn't need to make if I had had that environment. And that's really kind of the intergenerational nature of family dysfunction.
I can only imagine as sometimes as a parent who might not have even known about my own kind of stuff when these kind of conversations kind of come in, I can imagine sometimes the difficulty or the guilt or the discomfort that kind of comes up by hearing all of these things. So what we've seen here at the center as well is that when nowadays people are very well researched, right? So people are very well researched in terms of what they believe might be the problem, right? And so how do you feel about the level of the direction of the mental health when it comes to the work that has been traditionally been in regarding treatment of families or treatment of families through trauma? How is your perspective about what's been the zeitgeist before this?
Well, before this, the traditional pattern was that the child was sent to therapy, which, that's how people were trained. They were doing what they were taught to do in their educational programs. And, there are people that are really pretty gifted in working with children. But the reality is that the children are not in charge of the environment. And if we send them to therapy without changing the environment of the home, what we end up doing is convincing this child that their experiences and what their body is telling them is true can't be relied on. And what we do is embed in that person a doubt about their own experiences and feelings. Well, what I'm feeling can't be real because, all the adults in my life think what I'm doing is on purpose, or is something wrong with me. And we don't mean to, but the system of care really just strips layer after layer of self-esteem away from the child, convincing the child that they are the problem. And yet children are designed by biology to be dependent on an adult as a co-regulation tool. That's how they learn to regulate. So if the adults are not regulating well, the child doesn't have the ability to learn that. Now, therapists can do those things with them in therapy, but let's say you go to therapy an hour a week, that means the other 167 hours, they're not in environments that can do that. And we're expecting the therapist with that 1 hour a week to change the way this child works. And that's not even rational. If we really want children's, I don't care if it's ADHD or, anything that's, environmentally driven like ADHD, the environment has to change. And that means that the adults in the child's world have to change.
Yeah.
But, that's fundamental. Think about it in a business. If you want to use a different metaphor, if a company is going to pursue a culture, the culture has to be led by the C-suite of the company. And if the C-suite is a mess, the entire company suffers.
Absolutely. And this is something that we've seen because we practice it from this familiar manner. This is the results of this is something that we've seen in our organization as well. So we have families that come in, or traditionally what happens is that either they've been sent by therapists to do trauma work specifically for the child, right? And so when they come in with that mindset that I want the child to be better. And it's completely understandable because there's a lot of love that they have for that child, and the environment and the information that they've gotten so far is very much, I gotta fix him or her. Or and so when we come in and we kind of bring them into the conversation and orient them about the process of it, initially there's this original discomfort that kind of kicks in, right? About
Yeah.
I'm not really here, but it's their problem here. So how do you inform the family about this in terms of the discomfort that they're feeling and the naturalness nature of it?
Well, you have to be honest with them when you first begin to talk with them, and explain that children really aren't designed to be self-regulating without a uh, co-regulating with adults until somewhere between 11 and 13 years of age. So we have a lot of people that are, sending 6, 7-year-olds to therapy. And what we know is that if the parents are calm, nurturing, good at attaching with their children, good at creating a nurturing environment, a lot of the symptoms that we see that give problems, particularly in school settings, begin to diminish all on their own. Instead of that, though, we can, the schools want the kid to behave. They really want the kid to be acquiescent and compliant. We also find a lot of parents that aren't managing themselves well, that just want the kid to, not create any problem for them because they're overwhelmed already. I have never met a parent, a lot of people say, well, parents don't want to be involved in therapy. But that's not true. I've known a lot of parents that are so overwhelmed by their own life, they just don't have the energy to do a good job raising their children. I've met folks that are terrified to do anything because they're either afraid of what their extended family will think of them, what their neighbors will think of them. This isn't how I was raised. And so they're kind of afraid to take any action to make changes. And I have folks that, didn't grow up with experiencing attachments that were secure or loving, or worse, were performance driven. And so they don't know how to form those kind of relationships with their own children. And while that's true, and I recognize it, what I haven't seen is, I haven't seen people that don't want their kids to grow up and be responsible adults. They want their kids to be happy. They want their kids to be successful. So I think a lot of times it's more the fear of the therapist in having difficult conversations than it is really a problem to get the parents involved.
Yeah, there is a fear of disappointment, right? Even as a human, that would be a very natural thing. As a therapist, you want to do a good job. That's the stuff that you've been trained into doing as well. So there's a lot of unlearning or relearning that's kind of taking place in that process. What happens when? So what happens when the kid is resistant on this? Like, imagine if there's another side, right? So, for example, a 13-year-old is finds the family unsafe, right? And they are like, I don't want the family involved in my process, right? And as a practitioner, you're very well aware that the work of regulating the family is what's going to help the dysregulation in the process become a lot more safer, a lot regulated, and then the individual work can happen also. So
The challenge with that is that the child isn't capable of changing the environment. You can help them regulate when they're with you, you can encourage them, but most human beings respond to their environment. You know, if you walk into a room and the music is playing at 200 decibels, you're going to experience real discomfort. There's a real high likelihood that you're going to leave that room. You're going to withdraw, or you're going to do something to dissociate, to shut down from the experience you're having. That's a correct biological response when your system's being overwhelmed. So we have well-meaning people sending kids to therapy without understanding that, you know, really biologically based, in other words, genetically based mental illness, which is, you know, a lot of times when people think of kids having ADHD, they think it's a, you know, it's a in the genes of the person. But what we know from, you know, genetic studies going back almost 3 decades is that in all really human genetic related diseases never emerge much past 1.5 or 2% in any population. So when you have, for example, in the US, 38% of school age children diagnosed with ADHD, what that tells you is there's a lot of misdiagnosis because we can give them medication to manage them with it if we give them a diagnosis of ADHD. And no, you know, the school counselors, the teachers, the psychologists, the you know, public health counselors don't want to have these difficult conversations with dysregulated parents. So we have schools where, you know, in some of the more stressful communities, we have schools where, you know, 50% or better of the kids are on some kind of daily medication to help them function at school. But a lot of, you know, and those that really do have the biological piece tend to benefit from that medication. But those that don't, what ends up happening, it may help for a little while and then the problem like reemerges and they end up going from medication to medication because the adults in their world don't know how to create an environment that's stable. Whether that's a teacher in a classroom, you know, the people that live in a community or the parents.
you know, when you mentioned ADHD, that's something that is very prevalent or growing, at least here in Pakistan as well, where a lot of people who are looking to know what is happening for them in terms of their dysregulation. And, you know, the ADHD is more available or accessible in terms of an identification of sorts.
Sure.
You know, so one of the culture that kind of comes in is that there's this very undefined or kind of if someone gets diagnosed with ADHD, or that's like a stamp sort of, right? That's very permanent in nature, or it's perceived in that way as well. Does the dysregulation, because this is information that the family would benefit from as well. So what's your understanding of trauma and ADHD, and how could the family benefit and individual also benefit from this information?
Well, the physiology of toxic stress, um, you know, if you stress hormones like cortisol and the norepinephrine and epinephrine, which are your adrenaline and noradrenaline, when they are above what's baseline for this individual body, because it's going to be different for each body, you're going to see them engage in poor attention, and they're going to be fidgety, and all of the symptoms we see from that are justifying the diagnosis of ADHD is really very similar to what you would see in any child that's exposed to toxic stress. We give them medications because, and I can talk about this from the point of view of a system. This in the schools, we want to give them medication because we don't want to have to change the way we do things. We want the kid to do it the way we want to do it. And we don't, one of the things that helps calm children is having a supportive relationship, something they don't have to earn by performance. And so the same thing is true in families. If I say my kid's got this disorder and I can give medication, then I don't have to change the family dynamic. So there's a real rush to give a diagnosis and give medication, but what it does is it tells the people in charge of the environments, you don't have to do anything. It's really something wrong with the kid, and we'll medicate them and that will solve it all. Well, it mostly doesn't solve it.
Yes, and I think what it does also is just kind of continues that loop of mistrust and hurt and the like a very pathogenic kind of approach that kind of continues to that.
Well, and what you end up doing is, again, wounding the self-worth of the child. But if I'm a very dysregulated adult in a child's world, boy, it's really so comforting for me to think it's not anything I'm doing. They've got this thing, this disorder, and there's even medication for it. So I'm going to run to that because that's so much less work than me actually having to be deliberate, be intentional, manage my own emotions, and actively create an environment that is good for the kid.
As a family person who is being introduced to these kind of informations, or at least getting this kind of first step, what would you suggest could be sort of like a tool that could be a start off to the journey, right? So for example, because it's yes, the work is difficult, it takes a lot more time, and also the information that they might have received could be from that very traditional set of resources. So if someone hears this message, that in order to really help the family, you gotta regulate together, right? Or you gotta become more aware of the responsibility that the person leading the family has on them. So what would you invite them as a first step to this journey?
Probably the first thing I would do is make sure I'm orienting them really well so that they understand. So I'm building a relationship with them. I'm explaining how we do things, how it works. And then I'm going to spend a significant amount of time going through the physiology so they understand what's really going on and help them kind of understand it from their own lived experience. And so as that happens, what I also find is that quite often, a lot of the adults that I've worked with over the years, I'm the first safe relationship they've had. And so, what they're doing a lot is kind of mirroring what I do with them, they do it with their family. And so part of this is it requires we who are working with these families to be living our life the way we're trying to encourage them. So if you don't have a therapist or an educator that is, not regulating themselves well, if they are not able to connect well with other people, if they don't know how to nurture an attachment that's, that doesn't require performance, um, they're not going to be able to help somebody else do that. And so and a good number of people that are attracted to the field, they're not regulating themselves well. So of course, they're not going to want to have these difficult conversations with families. They're just going to want to fall in and let's treat the kid and not, let's, because they aren't regulated themselves well enough to do this work.
Yeah, and I can imagine just the journey of that, right? So because even for me, I remember before I got introduced to this way of working, being more congruent, being more honest, it was a lot more easier to see other people as that problem. Because that's what's always that's the way the books were written. That's the way the information was there.
Well,
And I think ever since being more attuned to that physiology of my own self, being able, it has helped me connect on a professional level, yes, but on a personal level also. It's helped me become more regulated with my own family, have
sure.
taken responsibility of my own self as well, and a lot more different kind of elements that kind of kicks in. Um, what about the narration, right? What about when the families imagine if they have gone through something um, horrific or big, like a car accident or any kind of single event experience that might have happened? Does this kind of work also help with that?
Yeah, so absolutely. And makes it actually easier because if life was going pretty well and they had this bad thing happen, about 80% of the time, if the relationship is strong enough and nurturing enough, they will handle that well without therapy, because they have the resources. For those that are going to go through this as a family and don't have the resources that could really help them, part of what that journey looks like is as you go through, you instead of what most people do, which is highlight the focus on how miserable it was and how much they were hurt and how devastating it was, is we focus instead on what we call expanding the narrative, which is, that was a pretty awful thing, but the next day you got up and went to work. How did you get yourself to do that? What did it take for you to, get yourself out of bed and to take the actions you needed to get to work? What was, to get the kids to school? And I'm going to spend most of my energy exploring how they took action to move forward. Because dwelling on the emotional parts and how painful it was is going to not really be all that helpful. All it does is strengthen that the part of the nervous system that gets really excited when we are in a survival or we're experiencing pain, which tends to shut down our ability to really change and sustain a change. So yeah, I'm going to focus on, what it is that they did, how they did it, you know.
Yeah.
Um, I know you've had a really rough week. I can see it in your countenance, in your face. I can see you've had a rough week. And with as rough as it is, how did you decide to actually show up today? What did you have to overcome to actually sit here today or to meet with me today? That's a lot more beneficial for the client at all ages and in all settings to focus on the actions they've taken, the movements they're making, rather than the pain and misery they're suffering.
There's this book I'm reading right now. It's called Bad Therapy. And it really follows around the same lines of how rumination over your problems just reinforces the physiology of that. And it's an amazing book that really kind of falls under this kind of line. as we reach an end to this conversation, in Pakistan and obviously other places in the world as well, there is a traumatized culture. There is a culture where there is a lot of external violence, dysregulation
Sure.
on a very, very mass level. If there was a message that you would want to have for the family, at the end of this conversation, what would you want to share with the families who are trying to help themselves through this process?
Well, and I have some sensitivity. I'm to what Pakistan culture has endured. They were colonially, they were colonized and brutalized for like 175 years. And the parting gift of the colonists was to push people all over the country and create all sorts of turmoil and mess up families, starting in like 1947. And and you had multiple generations impacted by being having these traumatic experiences. And so a lot of the folks that um, survive that lack the family skills that were in place before that. And so really, I think my hope for Pakistan and other countries that have gone through similar things is that by introducing this, we can reacquaint them with what used to be just considered normal process, where your family and your community, everybody was equally responsible for the children. So if the parents weren't that great, auntie or uncle or, even though they weren't real blood kin, that's where they pitched in and helped and they covered and the community supported children.
Yeah.
And what I really hope emerges out of this change is kind of a renewal of that kind of mentality, and not um, and not a westernization of the culture. Because a lot of times what I see in cultures that have experienced colonization is, even though they hated the colonists, they begin to adopt the culture of the colonizer. And so now they're lost because it doesn't fit. So I'm hopeful that as if we can get these changes in place and help people really understand what's going on, that we can actually build enough momentum to build more supportive families, build a more supportive community, build back in some of what it was lost from a couple of 100 years of really miserable intergenerational transmission of stress. So I don't, a lot of people say, well, this country is this way and they do that and they're very critical. I'm not that way. I really think that most of the time people are doing the best they can with what they know and what they've experienced. And so I'd like them to have a different experience.
Yeah.
That was a little
On,
long-winded, I'm sorry.
but I'm sure it will be impactful, and I'm sure it will help the people who really want to hear this message. So I want to thank you for the time. I want to thank you for a lot of things, and I'm looking forward to having more conversations with you in the future as well.
Take care.
Okay.
It was a pleasure being here, and I'm really proud of the work you guys are doing, and hope to be able to support it in a way that is meaningful for you.
Thank you. Take care.
Bye-bye.